Hello listeners, this talk is in response to hooha to the fla. I believe it's my third response video to him, so perhaps I should start paying him royalties or make him my assistant or something. Anyway, here's what he wrote to me. Hey reactionary expat, here's a few good questions for you. What do you suppose makes Taiwan so special as to make people the right-wing thinkers they are and be fine with a limited government? How long have they been like this in their history? Is it just a blip or something substantial? If you look throughout history, it would seem almost every country had or currently has at least some left-wing ideology. It doesn't matter if they were predominantly white nations in the Anglosphere, Latino nations, or Asian nations. Every nation at some point has had some leftist ideology. What can we learn the most from Taiwan in how the people live with and accept a smaller government? Okay, well, thank you for your comments and questions. Hoo-ha to the fla. Hopefully this talk will answer your queries. I'd like to begin though by saying that I actually don't think that Taiwanese people do have a limited government mindset as such. At least not in the way that it seems you, and certainly I, would consider the phrase limited government. They come at this from a very different angle. They have a very different set of cultural traditions and history and so on and so forth. And so in as much as they sometimes appear to want smaller government, I think it's more of a coincidence that it coincides with our thoughts on the same matter. And I think it would be somewhat of a mistake to project our way of coming at this topic upon them. Before I get into all of that though, I'll give you a brief rundown on the history of Taiwan, because I think this will help to illustrate some of the points that I will try to discuss later on in the talk. So Taiwan has always been, or at least until fairly recently, it has been somewhat of a wilderness, a frontier, if you like. There are actually multiple islands that make up what's called the Republic of China. And Taiwan is the main island, and then there are some smaller islands, some of which are in groups. And they're also controlled by the government here, called the Republic of China. And people often refer to that as Taiwan. It's the Republic of China and Taiwan are slightly different things, but they more or less overlap at this point. Now, some of those other islands were settled by the Han Chinese earlier on than the main island of Taiwan itself. That wasn't really settled by Han Chinese until about the 16th century. And there are a number of reasons for this, and they're fairly straightforward. The first is to do with the geography and the climate. Taiwan is very mountainous. There's actually very little flat land in Taiwan. And so, of course, that mountainous terrain, coupled with the fact that Taiwan, even to this day, is quite heavily forested, at least in the mountains, and I believe it had more forests prior to the modern era. Those sort of geographic and or topographic, I suppose, and issues to do with vegetation meant that it was difficult to settle here, and the climate didn't help either. Part of Taiwan is tropical and the rest is subtropical, and Taiwan frequently gets some fairly severe typhoons that blow through here, and I imagine that in the past those would have done major damage. Even nowadays they do a fair bit of damage. They destroy a lot of crops and they rip down billboards and things like that. Trees, some minor structures get destroyed periodically. And for a real sort of taste of how things might have been several centuries ago in Taiwan, you can look at what happens in the Philippines every time there's a major typhoon, because the Philippines are just to the south of Taiwan, and typhoons usually move from the Pacific Ocean through the Philippines up through Taiwan, and then they go on towards mainland China or even up towards Japan. And the Philippines are at a level of development below that of Taiwan, and whenever there is a major typhoon, it causes major destruction in the Philippines. And I imagine that in the past, similar things would have happened in Taiwan. So that's the first reason why Taiwan wasn't settled really by the Han Chinese until the 16th century. They also have earthquakes as well, which periodically cause some fairly severe destruction. But the second reason is also to do with the local populace. The indigenous people in Taiwan, the Taiwanese Aborigines, way back in the day, they actually came from mainland China, and then they moved to Taiwan, and then they spread throughout the Pacific, as far east as Hawaii and as far south as New Zealand. All of those people are descended from the same people who are here in Taiwan. And they have a warrior culture, and they were quite fierce. Even into the 20th century, they still had headhunters. So, of course, that also made it difficult for Taiwan to be settled by the Han Chinese. Nevertheless, the Han Chinese did eventually begin to settle Taiwan in force, and the 17th century saw a number of conflicts between different groups. So obviously there were clashes between the Han Chinese and the Aborigines, but also the Dutch decided to get in on the act, and there were clashes between the Dutch and the people who were in Taiwan at that time, both the Han Chinese and the Aborigines, and eventually the Dutch clashed with the Ming dynasty, which was the Chinese dynasty at that time. Then the Spanish arrived, and the Dutch and the Spanish clashed, and the Dutch managed to defeat the Spanish. The Dutch, when I say the Dutch were in Taiwan, they never really controlled Taiwan. They principally controlled part of the southwest, but not the entire island. The Spanish tried to settle in the north, and the Dutch saw them off from the north. Various other Europeans tried to come at various points, but they never really got a toehold here. And eventually, after the Spanish were seen off by the Dutch, the Ming dynasty collapsed in China. And around that time, there was someone called Koxinga, I think that's his name. He nominally had allegiance to China, but he was sort of his own force as well. And he managed to see the Dutch off. So the Dutch were driven out of Taiwan. And then, that was, as I said, that was around the time that the Ming dynasty collapsed. And they were replaced by the Qing dynasty. And the Qing dynasty, they're actually one of two foreign dynasties in China. The other one being the Yuan dynasty. The Yuan dynasty was the Mongols, essentially. And the Qing dynasty, they were from what's known as Manchuria. But even after the Qing dynasty was established, they never really got Taiwan under control either. They never really brought it entirely to heel. Taiwan was still known as a frontier, and it was still known for its piracy. So even after that, in 1895, the Qing dynasty went to war with Japan, or that was the conclusion of that war, the First Sino-Japanese War. And they ceded, amongst various possessions, Taiwan to the Japanese. So the Japanese controlled Taiwan from 1895 until 1945, so 50 years. But they still never got Taiwan completely under control. They did a reasonable job of getting it under control, but they never fully got it under control. And they developed Taiwan considerably during the half century that they ruled Taiwan. After World War II ended, Taiwan was returned to possession of China, which at that time was ruled by the Republic of China, who had replaced the final Qing dynasty emperor in 1911. So they'd been ruling for, 38 years at that point. Now, as soon as World War II ended, the Chinese Civil War, which had been underway prior to World War II and sort of on and off to some extent during World War II. The civil war resumed, and the communists under Mao Zedong defeated the nationalists, also known as the KMT, who were led by Chiang Kai-shek. So the nationalists fled to Taiwan in 1949. And their original plan was to use Taiwan as a base to sort of regroup and then launch and from which to launch a counterattack and eventually retake China on the mainland. That never happened, of course. And a lot of the issues that still exist today in terms of everything from architecture to the economy to corruption, various sort of ethnic grievances and so on, exist from that time when the KMT came to Taiwan, because the KMT were incredibly corrupt. The founder of the Republic of China, Sun Yat-sen, he was known for having ties to organized crime, and they used to regularly shake down the middle class in Shanghai. And during World War II, supposedly Chiang Kai-shek, who replaced him, whenever he received armaments, he actually sold some of them to the Japanese. And he also managed to really upset a lot of people in China. And that's part of why the communists had so much support, because the KMT was so corrupt and just had a sort of a bandit mentality towards anyone and everyone. And this didn't change when they arrived in Taiwan. So they very much saw the locals as firstly collaborating with the Japanese, which was somewhat true, somewhat untrue, but collaborating with the Japanese and having been having adopted Japanese culture and so on to a certain extent, but also just they saw the locals as being people they could loot, essentially, because the standard of living was actually higher in Taiwan under the Japanese than it was for quite some time under the KMT, because the Japanese did develop the country a lot more, and the KMT really looted the place. And this caused various issues, one of which was that there was an incident called the 228 incident. It occurred on the 28th of February. I can't remember the year. I think it was in the 50s. And martial law came into effect after that. And the KMT really suppressed local cultures and languages in Taiwan. At that point in Taiwanese history, of course, there were still Aborigines and they had their own cultures and they had their own languages. But even the Han Chinese who lived in Taiwan at that time, many had adopted Japanese customs and language, but those who didn't speak Mandarin, generally speaking. Mandarin was imposed upon them. They spoke one of two other languages usually, and many still do to this day. The Taiwanese dialect of Chinese, which is part of a sort of a subgroup of languages called Minnan, which originates in southeast China, particularly around Fujian province, which is the province closest to Taiwan on the mainland. So culturally and ethnically and linguistically, a lot of those people really had nothing in common with a lot of the people who came with the KMT after World War II, and they were suppressed by those people. And there was also another group called the Hakka, who are a group I've mentioned before. They're a diaspora that exists all throughout China and also the broader Chinese-speaking world in Southeast Asia and so on as well. So those two groups, both the Taiwanese and the Hakka, had their cultures and languages suppressed. And this has had far-reaching implications even to this day. The opposition to the KMT, who recently won the elections in Taiwan, the DPP, they have a lot of their base in the south of Taiwan, particularly the southwest of Taiwan. And that's an area also where Taiwanese is the first language. Mandarin it's changing, but Mandarin is really the second language of most people in that part of Taiwan. And so there are all these sort of long-lasting scars and so on from the martial law period. Now, democratic reforms occurred throughout the 1980s in Taiwan, and these culminated in two two significant events. One was the lifting of martial law in 1987. Martial law was actually lifted in different parts of Taiwan, on the different islands of Taiwan at different times, but on the main island of Taiwan, that was 1987. And then there were also direct presidential elections for the first time in 1996. So that's sort of a rundown of Taiwanese history for the past few centuries. And you can start to see here that Taiwan has, and the Taiwanese people, they have oscillated between having, on the one hand, a pretty heavy-handed government, and on the other hand, complete lawlessness, basically banditry, piracy, and so on and so forth. So earlier on I mentioned that when we think of limited government, it's not really the same thing as what happens here. And the Chinese actually have a saying for this, and the Taiwanese as well, in Mandarin. There's a saying that translates as heaven is high and the emperor is far away. Or a variation upon that saying is the mountains are high and the emperor is far away. And basically what that means is the authority figures are a long way away. They can't always keep an eye on us, and so when they don't, we can get away with whatever we can. And basically that's a very Taiwanese philosophy and Chinese philosophy as well, that you get away with whatever you can. It's not so much about doing the right thing, it's about what you can do without getting caught and punished. And Chinese punishment was often pretty harsh. The death by 1,000 cuts was actually a Chinese punishment that was invented in China. It's not just a saying, that's an actual thing that used to happen. So punishment was always pretty harsh in the Chinese-speaking world, but as long as you didn't get caught, you were fine. So because of this way of thinking, that basically you get away with whatever you can and basically screw everyone else if you can, the concept of the tragedy of the commons is extremely common here. I mean, it's not just common here, it's pretty much a non-Western thing, perhaps with the exception of, say, Japan and Singapore. The tragedy of the commons is extremely prevalent. I've noticed this all over the world. I haven't been to South America and I haven't been to Antarctica, but I've been to every other continent. And, it's essentially white people and Japanese and Singaporeans, essentially, who don't go in for this whole tragedy of the commons thing. Now, what is the tragedy of the commons? That's a term that was, it came into being, I believe, in the 19th century to describe a state of affairs in the UK. Now, the UK historically had areas called the commons, and this was usually to do with grazing of livestock. So each village would have a common area that wasn't owned by any one particular person, and it could be used by anyone within that community, usually for grazing. That's the usual context of it, though it can be applied to other situations and has been in more modern times. So in that situation, if everyone has access to a particular resource and others are going to use it, the incentive is always a short-term incentive to try to get as much of that resource as you can right now, because if you don't, someone else will. And there's a sort of a game theory that goes on here. And of course, if everyone's incentive is to pursue their short-term gain at the long-term expense of everyone, because, for instance, if you were grazing sheep on a paddock and you overgrazed that paddock, well, your sheep would do very well, but it might sort of destroy the paddock for a few years. No one would be able to use it because there'd be no grass left, everything would be trampled, and so on and so forth. That would actually hurt everyone, including you, in the long term. But in the short term, you'd benefit from that. And so there's always an incentive, a perverse incentive to do that, or for everyone to say, okay, I could pursue this short-term incentive, but it would actually hurt everyone, including me, in the long term, so I will refrain from doing so. And of course, everyone has to do that, because if anyone breaks that and they don't get punished, then of course everyone who doesn't pursue the short-term incentive actually suffers. And so, there's always a reason to defect. That's in many ways the rational choice if everyone else is doing it. Now, this concept of the tragedy of the commons, where people pursue their own individual short-term desires and benefits and so on, at the expense of everyone, including themselves in the long term. This has been applied to all sorts of other situations in the modern world, such as pollution, littering, overuse of any kind of resource, such as fisheries, overfishing fish stocks so that they go into terminal collapse, all sorts of things like this. It could be applied in many different ways. And at this point in time, many people, not all, but many people in the West have sort of figured this out, that what the tragedy of the commons is, and okay, maybe I need to sort of restrain myself slightly and refrain from doing these particular things because that will benefit everyone, including myself, in the long term. But most places in the third world have not figured this out, and of course that's part of why they are the third world, because the people are too stupid to figure this out, and they'll keep shooting themselves in the foot rather than everyone just start thinking in a sensible manner and thinking in the long term and all of this sort of stuff. And this is also typical in Taiwan. A lot of Taiwanese, maybe even most Taiwanese, still haven't really grasped the concept of the tragedy of the commons, and they operate from a very different set of base assumptions to people in the West. So they're often very concerned about very strong in-group or tribal loyalty. They have a concept called guanxi, which means relationships. Basically, it's like a circle of trust, essentially. If you have a relationship with someone and they're in your circle of trust and you're in their circle of trust, then you'll help each other out. But if a third person comes along with whom neither of you have guanxi, then screw that person, essentially. And that person will probably think the same about you. So if you're inside the circle of trust, you're good. If you're outside the circle of trust, then you're not good. And of course, that's very different to the way a lot of Westerners think. They're very concerned about altruism and all of this sort of stuff, often to the degree that they become it becomes pathological altruism. But that's a very different way of viewing the world to the way Taiwanese view the world. And so, again, they get away with whatever they can get away with. If the government's not watching them, then they'll get away with it. And it often has to be imposed upon them. So I'll give you a few examples. Basically, the farther away you get from Taipei, the more this is so, because obviously the people who go to Taipei tend to be smarter, and they tend to figure this stuff out more. The people farther away from Taipei tend to be the people who haven't figured this out, and they can't go to Taipei because they're not smart enough, or they couldn't exist there, and so on and so forth. So around where I live, you see all sorts of crazy driving, for instance, and every so often you'll see police do a sort of a little road check, and they'll pull people over if they do something wrong, like overtaking where they shouldn't overtake, or speeding, those kinds of things. And so people, they'll see the police, or someone will signal that there are police up ahead. So everyone will slow down, everyone will behave themselves. And literally the moment after they overtake the police car, so the police are only facing towards the oncoming traffic, or in a particular direction. As soon as the police have their backs to these people, they resume doing all sorts of crazy stuff, overtaking each other on blind curves, over the crest of a hill, all of this sort of stuff. And they just go back to their normal behavior. It's that situation of the mountains are high and the emperor is far away. The police can't see me now, so I only followed that rule so that they wouldn't catch me. Now I'll go back to doing crazy stuff. And that's very much the case here in many ways. Another example is that years ago when I first came to Taiwan, Taiwanese, they don't queue. They're not good at queuing. They're not like the English. They don't naturally sort of have a pastime of queuing. It's not one of their favorite activities. And so they didn't queue, and it was always a free-for-all. In particular, getting on a train or getting off a train. So boarding or alighting. And if you were trying to alight from the train, there would always be a bunch of people shoving to get on the train, to board the train. And of course, that doesn't work because the people who need to alight at that station, they're in the way of the people trying to board. And, of course, there's going to be a sort of a choke point there. And they could never figure this out. Every time I boarded a train or alighted from a train, I would see this every single time. And it only takes a few individuals to do this, to really screw it up. And then everyone realizes that if they don't do it, then someone else will get ahead of them. And so then it incentivizes other people to behave in like manner. Well, within the past few years, at least in and around Taipei, they've started putting lines on the ground, 2 sets of lines, parallel lines. And this began at the MRT stations, the subway stations. And it has now spread to certain other train stations, normal train stations as well. But outside of Taipei, you don't see this, and so people still do all the crazy stuff that they've always done. So it's very much a matter of if someone tells them, okay, here's a rule, follow this rule, and someone watches them, or if they paint lines on the ground or something, people will do this. If they have to take it upon themselves, they won't do it. They won't naturally do it. Some will, of course, but many won't. So, again, that's not quite the same way we would do things, or the way we would think of things in terms of limited government in the West. It may just be that this requires education. For instance, I remember as a child in Australia, there were anti-littering campaigns. There was a big thing in the sort of early to mid 80s, anti-littering campaigns. That approach seems to have worked relatively well. So maybe it's an education issue, and there were celebrities on TV. There was one guy, he was a famous sailor, a yachtsman, and he organised a big campaign called Clean Up Australia. People would go around to the beach or the park or wherever, along the side of the highway, that kind of thing, in big groups, and they do this at particular times each year and pick up litter and so on and so forth. So maybe it's like that. Maybe the Taiwanese will start to internalise these values as well. I don't know. It's hard to say. Another point on that, though, is that that period, perhaps in the early 80s, I think that perhaps marks the beginning of the nanny state in Australia. And it's sort of accelerated since then, of all these little things. Okay, they are annoying, they are frustrating, they do make the country look ugly and all of that sort of stuff. But they always have to keep upping the ante, and next thing you know, you have a nanny state, which is the case now in the West. So to some extent, it may not even be a good thing that these things are happening in Taiwan. I mean, it's good now, it's good in the short term, but in 20 years from now, they may have a fully fledged nanny state in this regard. I don't know, it's sort of hard to say exactly. And this brings me to the question of what we can learn the most from Taiwanese in this regard, in terms of the nanny state and so on, and that it appears that they don't have a nanny state here. To be honest, I think probably not much, because it's all about trade-offs. So to the extent that they don't have the fully fledged nanny state that many Western countries now do, or that many towards which many Western nations are rapidly moving, they don't have people saying, okay, the tragedy of the commons is a really bad idea, so I will restrain myself, and everyone else will also do that, and we'll just get along. We won't need anyone to tell us to get along, we'll just do it. It'll be self-organising. To the extent that they don't have the nanny state, it's not that occurs, it's simply that it's lawless, and the mountains are high and the emperor is far away, and they get away with whatever they can. And so there's not a cop with a speed camera every 200 meters here, as there is in Australia, for instance. But the trade-off for that is that you have a bunch of guys driving like complete yahoos all the time. And I mean, this is a sort of a perennial point of discussion amongst Westerners in Taiwan, and I suppose in many other third world nations or developing nations also, that the driving is insane, it's dangerous, it's reckless, and all the rest of it. So, it's not just that you don't need a cop there so everyone will just behave themselves, It's a binary thing. There doesn't seem to be a grey area. And of course, I've made my peace with some of these things to some extent. I mean, there are still times when I'm driving and I freak out at some of the things that happen. I do struggle with them, but more or less I've made my peace with them. Though I don't know to what extent I really want to live amongst this in the long term. But these are trade-offs. So other areas, for instance, are dodgy construction. You don't have 1,000,001 building codes, or there probably are, but they don't enforce them. Okay, so you don't have the government telling you, what color curtains you have to hang in your window, or something absurd like that. But the trade-off there is that there's a lot of really dodgy construction, and every time there's a big earthquake, a whole bunch of buildings fall down, and they find out that these buildings did not comply with the earthquake codes and all this sort of stuff. The cavities between the walls were not filled in properly, and they just threw garbage in there. Or there was one several years ago where they just put empty oil cans in there, in between the walls. Well, that sort of stuff happens. There are issues here to do with pollution and litter. I mean, people dump stuff all the time here. And there are all sorts of scandals, even aside from the construction scandals. There's a food scandal here every couple of years. There was one a year or two ago where some people were getting some disused oil, cooking oil or something, and it was all dirty and polluted and so on. And some of it was in gutters or something like that. And they were repackaging it and reselling it to restaurants. So this sort of thing happens periodically here. Justice is often quite patchy, the strong bully the weak, and all sorts of stuff. If you're a pedestrian, you give way to the trucks don't give way to you, all this kind of stuff, right? So, it's trade-offs, because this is a personal thing. People need to take it upon themselves to behave. They need to internalize this concept that morality, or you don't behave in a particular way just so you won't get caught and punished. You do it because it's the right thing and it actually benefits everyone, the entire society, including you. It makes society a nicer place in which to live, and all of this stuff. It's, we get this whole thing, right? And that in so doing, you don't need anyone to wield a heavy hand over you and all of this sort of stuff. But this is a really Anglo-Saxon, Northern European kind of way of approaching this issue. But, it's not a thing that they do here. So, it might come off as somewhat arrogant or parochial or something to say this, chauvinistic to say this, but I actually don't think that the West really has much to learn, at least from Taiwan, but probably the East in general, from this. Perhaps only Japan and Singapore are countries we could possibly copy, but certainly not Taiwan. The West used to have its act together. The West used to actually have things sorted out. The West was broadly functional and free at the same time, broadly speaking. Now it's not. Now it doesn't have its act together. But this is more an issue to do with the West rather than the East being some sort of Shangri-La that we should copy. This is more about the West declining, the West becoming worse. And, part of that is because the West has directly and intentionally abandoned a lot of these things that made the West great. And of course, that was it was not accidental. There were people who pushed for this and who actively undermined the culture. So of course, it should come as no surprise that they've been somewhat successful. Well, actually not somewhat, quite successful. So it was partly that, and it was partly that the West imported the rest of the world. And so again, it should come as no surprise that if you import a bunch of people from the third world who genetically and culturally are from the third world, that your society will increasingly come to resemble the third world, including the way in which people begin to behave in a manner that encourages the tragedy of the commons and so on and so forth. And we're seeing that now, obviously. So, the West used to have things sorted out. It abandoned those things, and it's importing people from the third world. Does it need to keep importing these people in the hope that we will somehow learn something from them? What would we have to learn from them if their own countries are completely dysfunctional? Surely all we would do is import dysfunction. I mean, this seems like common sense, but for many it's not, and of course for many others it's not just that they're stupid, it's that they're actively trying to undermine the West. So I really don't think that there's much that can be learnt from Taiwan in with regard to limited government, because it's sort of a case of a broken clock is correct twice per day. And so it may be possible to look at Taiwan, and this may be partly my fault for not accurately describing Taiwan in previous talks that I've made, but it may be easy to look at Taiwan and say, wow, they don't have a nanny state, what are they doing right? But that's looking at it slightly the wrong way, I believe. And I think for the West, to go away from having a nanny state, there are really two basic conditions for having a well-ordered society that is not a nanny state, where people get along, it's functional, all that stuff, but no one needs to be on anyone else's back or breathing down anyone's neck, any of that sort of stuff. So the first one is that you need to have a population that, on average, has fairly low time preference. That just means people who can think ahead into the future and delay gratification now for future gains, right? So, that obviously that kind of way of thinking prevents the tragedy of the commons. So you need to have a population of people who, on average, have a low time preference, and you need to have ways of curtailing the ability for those who still have high time preference from really effecting any kind of change upon the society. And as part of that, you need people who are fairly intelligent, because obviously people who are... Not everyone who is intelligent will have low time preference, but probably everyone who has low time preference will be intelligent. So you need a fairly intelligent population there. And that's pretty obvious, right? The other thing that needs to be done is you need a society that's going to be fairly homogenous, because that way people see each other as kind of friends, allies, relatives, whatever, rather than competitors. And so this prevents them from engaging in direct competition that leads to a kind of spiraling upwards of time preference, whereby if one person engages in a high time preference activity and they either don't get punished or even get rewarded for doing so, and I guess they get rewarded if they don't get punished. It's a sort of an indirect reward because they gain something at someone else's expense. So, if you have a whole bunch of people who see each other differently, and one of them does that, one of them engages in high time preference behavior and gets away with it, then the other people pretty soon will start to figure out, hey, if I don't get in while the getting in is good, then I'm going to miss out. And so even people with low time preference, under that set of conditions, it's rational for them to begin behaving in a manner that involves high time preference. And then everything goes to hell. And then, of course, the solution to that is you have the heavy hand of government to get everyone under control. And, that doesn't entirely work. But, you've sort of destroyed the trust and the low time preference nature of the existing society. The only way to get everything back in order is, with a big hammer, essentially. So You know, these two things of having a society of people with low time preference and high intelligence, and having a whole bunch of people like that who are all basically from the same group, but these are the two things that the West is not doing, and it should be doing. It used to do. And if the West just got back on track with regard to those 2 points, it would be fine. I don't think it really needs to copy Taiwan. I don't think it has a lot to learn. I mean, there are some things to be learned from Taiwan, but not their sort of lawlessness, if you like. All right, so that is the end of the talk. I hope that has cleared a few things up. Hoo-ha to the fly. Maybe it's not quite what you expected, but nevertheless, I hope that has shed some light on this matter. And again, thank you for suggesting this topic for me. For everyone else, as always, please comment beneath this video, and thank you for listening.